Hello, my name is Nicole Ventrone. I'm a 2017 Teach for America Corps member in Baltimore, Maryland. This upcoming May, I'll be graduating from Johns Hopkins University with my master's in education, which is a huge honor. Today, I would just like to further explore some of the teaching practices that I highlighted in my recent portfolio submissions. Thank you so much for taking the time out to look at this, and I'm looking forward to any feedback that you may have. To begin, I just wanted to review my personal teaching philosophy, which grounds and stands at the root of all of my daily practices and instructional tactics. So I'm particularly inspired by this Kofi Annan quote, which says, "Education is a human right with the immense power to transform." So with this approach, I'm just always thinking of my children as more than students. I'm really thinking them and envisioning them as future leaders, as people that could be change agents in our society. Once someone adopts this approach as an educator, I truly believe that is when they are able to elevate their teaching and in turn elevate their students. I'm focused not just on making sure my students make gains academically and within our content, but I'm also focused on building their skills of curiosity, critical thinking, and their growth mindsets. I want my students to ultimately transform into the capable, productive 21st century citizens that I know that they can be. And when they make that transformation, ideally, I hope that they use those powers within themselves to empower others. For me, it's about creating this global humanity and making sure that my kids really grow up to be the types of people that look out for one another. As I think of my students as these change agents, albeit on national and international levels like presidents and prime ministers, or just important, impactful people in their own communities, I'm really focused on making sure that I, as their educator, am giving them the foundation that they need to be successful in these roles. So for me, that foundation really relies on their academic standing and like their awareness of the content, whether it be grade-specific content, content that they maybe missed in previous years, or in an ideal circumstance, I'm pushing forward their growth and extending their learning. So as you can see on this slide, I began the year hoping that my students would make at least 1.6 years of growth in my classroom. However, based on data that occurred at the end of March, so approximately 6 weeks ago, my students have already expressed and demonstrated 1.78 years of growth. And even though the students have exceeded my goal, I'm very committed to just continuing them on the proper trajectory. To give you some insight into how I have made this growth so far and continue to foster like more academic achievement, please review the remaining slides. So to make these academic gains, I think that the biggest piece of advice I would give any new teacher or any teacher that's looking to improve their practice is plan, 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 plan. I think that we are engaged in a type of work where there are always things that are just popping up, whether it be issues with their students, with their families, just different responsibilities in our personal lives or professionally at school. So in an effort to mitigate how those just random occurrences can impact our teaching, I really, really, really aspire to just always be as productive with my planning time as period and making sure that I have a very, very clear understanding of where my students are, where I want them to go, and the steps that I'm going to take to get there. For me, I really break down my planning into 3 big buckets. So I do year-long planning that gives me a nice overview of exactly what's occurring over the course and the months of the school year. Then I do more granular unit planning, and then of course my daily lesson planning. So just for more insight into those 3 buckets, please continue on. So year-long planning marks the first step that I embark on to outline my school year. So for me, what that entails is looking at our school calendar, looking at the different modules in our curriculum or units, as some curriculums call them, and thinking about, okay, what are the major end of the year goals that my students need to accomplish? How much time do we have? How much time does the curriculum recommend for these various units? What do I know about my students based on data from last year? And I use all of that information to just inform a very, very honestly rather detailed outline of the school year. So I have a pacing calendar, which you could find on my portfolio site, that shows you the start and end dates of all of my different modules. And then I also go to the extent of creating the document that you see on this slide that considers the standards that will be occurring in an upcoming unit. It'll include the academic vocabulary, the foundational standards, so information and content that my students need to already be able to grasp before we can move forward. And then I just also give myself some reflective questions. So I know as an educator, as I'm working my way through this year-long plan and through this individual module, I'm giving myself that space to really think about my students very intentionally and understand, am I pushing them to that greater academic achievement? Am I doing what they need? And just making sure that everything is like appropriately responsive to my students and their needs. So this is just one small sample of my year-long planning process. If interested, please refer to my portfolio site for just a little bit more in-depth information. As I mentioned, part of my year-long planning process is really thinking about the big major end of year's goals for my students. So in order to be very, very explicit and clear for myself, and then in turn for my students and their families on what those goals are, I create what I call these I can statements. So essentially they're student-facing objectives that ideally my students will accomplish over the course of the year. So this is 2 of about the 4 pages for the 4th grade math curriculum. And as you can see, like not only do I have the objectives written in a student-friendly fashion, but I also include the standard. I just think that helps students begin to understand like where I'm getting my information from, like why I'm putting these requirements upon them, and just creating like more of a collaborative space between my students and myself and in regards to our curriculum. After I organize my year-long pacing guide, that is when I'm able to really analyze and reflect on individual units. So of course, there's much more to unit planning than what I pictured on this slide. If you're interested in seeing a full unit plan, please refer to my portfolio site. But what I wanted to highlight in this video, what I feel like is particularly evident and demonstrative of my impact, is how I am so targeted, where I'm really breaking down the individual skills that students need to access over the course of the module, and even more so the fact that I try to adopt a culture responsive lens when I'm unit planning. So in my context, teaching in Baltimore City, all of my students are low income. All of my students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. My entire class identifies as Black and or African American. Given the high minority, low income cohort that I work with, I have many students whose families have dropped out of school or do not have otherwise high educational attainment. That being said, I really make an effort to include them in the work that we do, and one way is doing so is breaking down a larger unit into what I frame as like a family-friendly overview. So I ultimately share this overview on Dojo. I'll send a flyer home, and it's just making sure that my students' families are informed and know what's going on. I think it just builds a community amongst my students, their guardians and parents, and myself. And it also just ensures that the work that I'm doing at school is then able to be reinforced at home in a way that sometimes is difficult given a variety of circumstances. So I think that's an aspect of unit planning that I really appreciate Johns Hopkins encouraging me to do. They're always reminding us to be culture responsive, but I really try to kind of push and extend myself to the next level by being intentional in how I'm culture responsive with this aspect of planning. After conducting all of these larger big picture aspects of planning, I'm finally able to think about the nitty-gritty daily plans and activities that I'll be doing with my students. For me, that's personally my favorite because I think that's where I get to embrace students' interests and make sure that their personalities are reflected and included in my lesson planning. That being said, if you're interested in seeing a full lesson plan that embraces this strategy, please once again refer to my portfolio. But I wanted to just highlight like two of the components of lesson planning that I believe most encourage my students' growth and is most indicative of my long-lasting impact as an educator. So one, I really emphasize cross-curricular planning, especially as an elementary teacher. I think it's important that we allow our students to recognize how the material that we might teach them in math can resonate with what we're doing in ELA and vice versa. I think that it's a luxury that I'm able to have full control over what my students do every single day. So since I'm fully aware, I should be using that and implementing that and designing essentially cross-curricular lessons rather. So here's just one lesson plan that I shared on my site. So basically we were learning about adjectives, they were writing something about adjectives, but at the same time in math, we were reviewing quadrilaterals. So then to accompany the adjective writing that my students eventually wrote, they were able to create a drawing that just only exclusively incorporated quadrilaterals. So that was just a fun, easy way for me to just connect learning for my students. As a second point, I highly emphasize differentiating. In my classroom, I teach both 4th and 5th grade students all content all day at the same time. So I really take a small group approach to learning and at the same time a differentiated approach to learning. So as you can see, I'm bringing up stations. My students are very familiar to working with stations given that they are in 2 different grade levels to begin with. And then as you can see, I just have very specific requirements for people at their different stations depending on their group's ability. So those are just 2 aspects of lesson planning that I really adhere to and believe that they contribute to the academic growth that my students have demonstrated this year thus far. For some people, I can understand why my planning might seem a little bit extensive. I don't know too many people that create I can statements for the entire year for all of their content areas. That being said, I really adhere to this philosophy because I've seen how it's impacted my students, which of course is my ultimate goal. So my students take a test called iReady. It is an objective computer adaptive test. So essentially it's just completely teacher removed. My students sign in on their own. They take their test on their own. It's very good preparation for PARCC. For more insight into the specifics of the test, please see the dramatic academic growth portion of my portfolio. That being said, I just wanted to highlight one component of the data, which just shows my students' progress to annual typical growth. So basically 100%, that percentage would indicate that students met what the program expected for them to meet in 1 year. So based on the test that my students took around March 20th, March 22nd, my students were making 178% growth or 1.78 years. So I'm just really hopeful that my students' growth will continue. I'm still embracing these strategies. I'm still adhering to these planning techniques. So I'm pretty confident that my students will just continue to soar and continue to transform. So in vein of continuing to develop my students as the future leaders that I know they're capable of becoming, I don't just exclusively focus on them as students. In fact, in my classroom, I really make an honest effort for my students to understand that I don't just view them in academic light, but that I really appreciate, value, and acknowledge them for who they are as people, for the entirety of their personhood, for all aspects of their quirky, silly, childlike personalities. So although I find habits of mind to be incredibly important for developing students in that vein, and I am committed to that, as you can see from my portfolio, I also find that there's a lot of personal growth that can occur when children are given increased access to different opportunities. So in this section of this video and this PowerPoint, you'll just get to a little bit more insight into the access opportunities that I provided my students this year. reference, the two major opportunities that I highlighted and discussed in my portfolio regarding access are a unit that I created regarding career exploration and financial literacy for my students, as well as a music week that I led and headed for the 4th and 5th grade students at my school, which for reference is about like 220 students. As an elementary school teacher and teaching students that are in 4th or 5th grade, whenever the topic of jobs or future opportunities come up, my students are very, very inclined and willing to say that they want to be like the next Cardi B. They're really interested in being big YouTube gamers. They would love to be YouTube game designers. And that is kind of the extent of where their job search ends. So given that I noticed this need in my classroom, I just thought it would be really wonderful to increase their awareness of different job opportunities and just help them understand how one effectively goes after finding a job. So in order to do so, we had a pretty multi-layered unit that involved a lot of the aspects that a typical adult would engage in. So we did a career interest survey, of course, one that was geared towards children, that helped students reflect on different aspects of their persona and then how it could eventually translate into a different job. We then, based on that information and that data, students were asked to pair up with a peer in our class. They did all of this research about their given career and then presented it to their classmates. This helped ensure that students were not only delving deep themselves, but that a lot of my students were getting more informed about the variety of careers that are available to us. I also, in conjunction with this, created a mini unit on financial literacy. So at this point, students learned how to write checks. They learned the difference between debit and credit. They learned how to balance checkbooks. This was really important for students to get a better handle on money and for them to be able to contextualize some of the salaries they had read about during their career research, how that would translate into kind of like real world day-to-day living. We also did a resume and interview workshop. That was a really fun experience where students got to just think through like what their assets are, what they're qualified to do, and how they would express that to a future employer. And then this whole unit concluded with a field trip to BizTown. BizTown is an organization that is focused on career development in elementary school students. So all of my students were given a job. As you can see in this picture, one of my students was a CFO of a small company. He was in charge of doing all of the payroll. So these students have these jobs and they just have to function throughout the day in their role to make sure that their company is successful. Well, I touched on this earlier. I just wanted to give further insight into why I elected to create this unit and why I elected to spend my students' time working on career exploration. So most research has found that students from minority backgrounds and specifically minority low-income backgrounds, they perceive that they have more limited career options for themselves than do their wealthier peers. At the same time, research has also found that these same students will express a desire for a higher level of education, but once again, do not believe that it's something that they could ever attain. So in other words, there's extensive research that implies that youth from low-income minority backgrounds just have internalized lower standards for their post-secondary options. So given that understanding, I felt like it was really important to just engage in dialogue with my students about career exploration, about post-secondary options. I was very startled and honestly upset that whereas I see my students as future leaders and change agents, there's research that says that they don't view themselves in that same light. So I wanted to use this opportunity to just help them like build their own self-esteem while simultaneously gaining access to a new opportunity. Ultimately, I feel like it has had really powerful impact on my students. In some of the conversations and some of the reflections that student wrote post this trip, post this experience, they were talking about how they felt more prepared for a real job. They commented on feeling how working is a really big responsibility. One of them spoke about, as seen in this in this example, that she could see herself as a CEO of a company. And as a young Black girl, in a society where unfortunately there's not many Black women in roles of CEO, I think it's really important that we start instilling those beliefs in them at a young age. And then also just like this aspect of perseverance, where students were saying like, oh no, when we're at our job, you really do have to work hard and you have to be the best that you can be. So for me, it was just meeting a need that I saw in my students, addressing an issue that research has found affects students like my own, and also transforming my students into being people that want to be positive contributors to our society and believe that they have the capacity to do so in a very meaningful way. So for me, I found it to be incredibly impactful, and I felt fortunate that my students were able to enjoy this experience. My students currently do not have access to a music education program. To mitigate the potential losses of that missed opportunity, I planned a music week for my students as well as some other students at our school who face a similar dilemma. So that included lessons on the elements of music as well as genres of music. So students were able to learn about different genres, learn about different components of music, and then as a competition, I would play clips and students had to figure out what genre appropriately aligned with the clip. We also had 2 guest speakers come in who are both practicing musicians. If you were to look at my portfolio, you could see some videos and clips of my students working with a guitar, working with a xylophone, playing makeshift drums, just really working with the musicians, honing their craft. One of the guest speakers specifically focuses on the relationship between music and culture and religion. So there was a whole conversation that occurred with that to help my students identify music and the arts as aspects and components of one's culture. So in addition to my students just finding this whole experience entirely engaging, I also feel like they walked away much bigger, better people for it. And I will go a little bit more in depth with that in the following slide. When reviewing my personal teaching philosophy, I emphasize how curiosity is a skill and just a character trait that I really focus on developing amongst my students. I find that curiosity would really be a key for a lot of my students attaining a lot of success in the future and just being able to impact others and their communities in the way that I know they're capable of doing. When someone is curious, they're thinking about problems, they're eager to solve problems, they're yearning to learn. So for me, I try to capitalize on my students' curiosity as often as possible. And in one way of doing so was with this music week. I knew that I had students that were very interested in the music. They're always sharing their latest favorite song or new artist. They really seem to bond with each other as well as with me on music. So in order to just embrace that own inherent motivation, I created this music week. In addition to just the engagement component of Music Week, I was very concerned about the vast decline in music and access to arts that are occurring across our country. In fact, research has shown that only 1 in 6 schools now have constant music programs, with one of my schools not being included in that statistics. Unfortunately, that's really concerning because research has also found that high quality music instruction can encourage students to score higher on reading tests, on spelling tests. This helps students with their vocabulary, and it's even found to increase attendance within different schools. So I wanted to help my students bridge the gap between our lack of access and at least just a burgeoning access to music and to a semblance of the arts. I think that ultimately my students walked away very impacted by this circumstance. They recognize how music can be a coping strategy for them, as many of my students deal with toxic stress or other issues leading to emotional disabilities and PTSD. I'm always looking for different coping mechanisms that feel satisfying and healthy for them. So I was really impressed to see that they began to understand music as a way that they could cope and just relax their own nerves. They also mentioned, one student, how music would help our school community, just like it helps one's individuality. I think that is evidence of how I try to celebrate my students as people, as I've mentioned earlier. I don't want my students to just feel like they are Miss Ventrone students. I don't want them to just identify by their grade or by their class. I want them to go through life like really empowered by who they are and feeling like they can inspire others. So in vain of that, I was very happy to see that students found that music and the arts could be a way that they could further express themselves and further develop their individuality. As a final point, I thought it was wonderful to hear that one of my students said that I can learn about music all of the time. I think that just was further evidence of how something like Music Week should be occurring in schools across the nation if schools are unable to provide more consistent music education. So I would love at the next school that I attend, given that my school is slated to close this year, to just put forth a music week or just to help develop a music after school program, because I think it's necessary for students as they are in these formative years. All right, thank you for continuing to listen and continuing to dive deeper into my teaching philosophy, my portfolio evidence, and ultimately the impact that I've left on my students. So we've already touched on my planning for instruction and how that increases my students' academic growth. We then went into how I've increased and enhanced my students' access to different opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to acquire, and how that has helped develop them as people in a variety of ways. And now I want to just show how I emphasize and am concerned with my students' growth as social beings. And in that, I mean how my students interact with one another, interact with the world, how they interact with like political and social issues especially. So for reference, my school was slated to close upon the end of this year. While we are still in the appeal process, right now it does seem like my students will be going to different schools. That being said, for a lot of this school year, there's been a lot of noise and attention spent on a campaign to save our school, to save Monarch. It's really, really been inspiring as an adult and as an educator to see students rally together and to be so concerned with making change that they are inspiring us, and they are the ones that are really giving us the ideas. Like, it's coming from the students because it is an issue that is so close to their heart. So I feel very, very proud of my students and like saddened that they've had to deal with this, but just impressed by the way that they've handled kind of an unfortunate situation. So I just want to highlight some of like the amazing things they've done. They wrote letters to lawmakers, they participated in protests, and they've shared opinions with newscasters. So I'll dig a little bit deeper into that as we continue. So in vain of our campaign to save Monarch, my students exerted a lot of time and energy brainstorming ways that they could protect their school and protect like what they felt was their home. So as you can see in my portfolio, my students, we did a whole Socratic seminar based on a news article that touched on our school's closing, but more importantly, gave context for why public schools and charter schools in Baltimore City are closed by our district. So really just helped my students understand what the procedure for school closures looks like, what information is considered when a school is closed, and then ultimately helped inspire them to consider what tactics they might want to embrace and utilize in order to counteract this movement. So as you can see, my students participated in different protests. One of the girls that's pictured in this, as you will see in my portfolio, she and her sister were willing to speak in front of an entire protest and in front of newscasters about why they felt like this school should stay open. In fact, they were the first students to volunteer willingly without any adult prompting to speak on behalf of this matter. So that just really demonstrated to me that the effort that I've exerted upon my students in helping them feel like they have a voice, feel like they are powerful individuals and soon to be change agents, that has has taken effect, that has impacted them, because these babies did it on their own. They were not asked by me. They were not asked by their principal. Like, they felt compelled to share their story, and they were able to do so in front of a crowd of people, which I think is really inspiring. Also on my portfolio, you could see a clip of another student of mine, a male student, who in a very similar circumstance, while at school, there was newscasters around, and he walked up single-handedly himself to the newscaster and asked if he could share why he felt like the school should stay open. So yet again, these are my own students, my 3 of 25, that are demonstrating that they have this really deep commitment to advocating for themselves and advocating for their local community. So I really am just impressed by them and like so proud of them. And then as a final note, more as a collective, my students were really, really invested in writing letters to lawmakers. So that was something that I thought was tangible and accessible to all of my students. And I also thought it was great that they came up with an idea that went directly to the people in power, as opposed to just like using other alternatives to approach this issue. As mentioned earlier, pictured in this image are my 2 female students that voluntarily spoke in front of the crowd, and in fact were the first of the 1,000 Monarch students to do so. So in addition to just really wanting to celebrate that huge example of advocacy, I also wanted to pull a quote from another student. This student said, "I have the voice, I have the choice, and I want to save Monarch." Given that my students are only in 4th or 5th grade, I think it's important to contextualize what 9 and 10-year-olds are typically talking about and typically what they're thinking about. It's rare to hear someone at this age have so much self-confidence and belief in themselves, specifically in their belief to overturn a huge circumstance such as a school closure. So for me, this is what inspires me as an educator, and like what makes me committed to this profession is knowing that I played a role in this student acknowledging that power within themselves and then choosing to act on it. So I find that this is one of the most powerful examples of impact that I could have asked for as a teacher, and it really makes me feel as if I have done some good for my students if students are walking away from my classroom feeling like they are strong and capable. Well, that concludes the 3 strongest aspects of my portfolio and the impact that they have had on my students. That being said, I would just like to take a moment to speak a little bit more from the heart about this profession, about this craft, and about the experience I've had with my students the last couple of years. I think that I speak for most educators when I say that we do not enter this work for accolades. We are not looking for external motivations, if I'm to use my teacher talk. Instead, we are here to serve children. That is our goal. That is our priority. I feel like when I go to work, my students are who I work for over any academic coach, any individual from Teach for America, or even my principal. I think that I wake up every single day and I go to bed every single day contemplating how I could be a better teacher for my students, because that is what they deserve. They deserve the best, because when I look at them, I see people that could really rattle and shake our world, and only in the best possible way. So I exert enormous amount of energy in making sure that my planning meets their needs, is differentiated appropriately, that it excites them, that it builds them as people and as social beings, that it helps them recognize the power that they have within themselves. And I feel like the examples that I have displayed, not only seeing the great academic strides that they have made this year, but also have they been able to just develop their own emotional regulatory systems by considering music as a component, by trying to view themselves in big positions such as CEOs later on in life, and being willing to speak in front of crowds and unfamiliar camera people to save a school without being prompted by any adult or assisted anyway. I think these are not, I would like to think these are just not coincidences. based on the students that have been placed in my class this year, but this is just based on the relationship that we have developed and the class culture that I've worked really hard to just formulate within my class. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to review all of this information. Please feel free to view my actual portfolio for more in-depth data and more in-depth artifacts and evidence, as well as to look at my demonstration of impact to just see what other constituents and important key actors in this work have to say about me and my teaching. Thank you again.